Welcome to MC Noctis, where the safest place is never as safe as it seems. Tonight's story comes from a forgotten river town in southern Louisiana, where people still lock their doors before the fog reaches the road. My father came home from the river just before dawn. For the next 31 days, he ate at our table, slept beneath our roof, and answered every question only my father should have known. But he never stepped into sunlight. He never seemed to breathe. And every animal in our yard began dying without a drop of blood left in its body. When an old spiritual healer finally entered our house, he took one look at my father and told us something my mother refused to believe. The man sitting in our kitchen had been dead for more than a month. Something had found his body beneath Black Cypress Bridge, and it had worn him home. Turn down the lights, put on your headphones, and remember this warning. Sometimes the dead come home because they miss you. And sometimes they come home because something else needs to be invited inside. This is The Devil Wore My Father's Body. I was 17 when my father died. The terrible part is that none of us knew he was dead. We lived outside Briar's Ferry, Louisiana, in a narrow white farmhouse between a cypress swamp and the Belém River. The town had one gas station, one Catholic church, and a volunteer fire department that flooded every spring. Everybody knew everybody else, and secrets rarely survived longer than a Sunday service. My father, Jonah Mercer, made his living catching catfish. He was a broad-shouldered man with sun-browned arms, a crooked front tooth, and a laugh that could be heard across the water. He was stubborn, but he was gentle. I never saw him strike my mother, frighten a child, or turn away a hungry neighbor. That matters, because the thing that came home wearing him was none of those things. The Belém River curved around town and passed beneath an abandoned steel crossing called Black Cypress Bridge. The bridge had been closed to traffic since the 70s, but fishermen still used it as a landmark. Nobody fished beneath it after dark. 6 workers had supposedly died while building its foundations. A schoolteacher vanished there in 1948. In the years that followed, boaters reported hearing laughter above them, even when the bridge was empty. My grandmother said something lived between the iron beams and watched the river for anyone foolish enough to pass below. My father called those stories swamp nonsense. On the night of August 17th, the moon was bright enough to turn the fields silver. Dad had been drinking bourbon on the porch when a neighbor stopped by and said the river was boiling with catfish. My mother, Ruth, begged him to wait until morning. Dad only smiled and lifted his keys from the table. "Fish don't wait for a man to sober up," he said. I helped him load a battery rig into his aluminum boat. It was an illegal contraption made from a car battery, copper cable, and 2 long probes. When the probes touched the water, the current stunned fish long enough for him to scoop them into a net. Before he pushed away, Mum caught his wrist. "Stay this side of Black Cypress," she said. Dad kissed her forehead. "I'll be home before the coffee's ready." Those were the last words I ever heard my real father speak. I woke sometime after 2 in the morning to the sound of the boat scraping against our dock. The engine was not running. I looked through my bedroom window and saw the boat drifting sideways through the fog. Dad stood in the center of it with his back to the house. His arms hung loose at his sides. He did not reach for the rope or try to stop the hull from hitting the pilings. I ran outside, barefoot. "Dad?" He turned, slowly. Moonlight covered his face, but his eyes looked completely black. Then he blinked, and they were normal again. I grabbed the bowline and tied the boat to the dock. Dad stepped onto the boards without speaking. His clothes were damp, and the air around him smelled like river mud mixed with something sweet and rotten. "What happened?" I asked. He stared past me toward the house. "Something was sitting on the bridge," he whispered. His hand closed around my shoulder. It was so cold that I felt it through my shirt. "Your mother awake?" I nodded. He walked toward the porch with an uneven, dragging step. When he reached the back door, he stopped and knocked 3 times. Mum opened it before I could tell her he had his own key. Dad smiled at her. Then he crossed the threshold. For the first 2 days, we thought Dad had suffered some kind of shock. He barely spoke. He sat at the kitchen table with his hands folded and watched the curtains brighten with the morning sun. Whenever a blade of light touched his skin, he pulled away as if it burned. Mom wanted to take him to a hospital. Dad refused. "Just swallowed too much river," he told her. His voice sounded rougher than before, as though another voice was speaking beneath it. He stopped drinking coffee. He stopped smoking. He would place food in his mouth, chew it slowly, then excuse himself and spit it into the sink. The only things he seemed able to swallow were raw meat and the blood left in the butcher paper. Mum pretended not to notice. By the 4th day, the smell had spread through the house. We checked the plumbing, the attic, and the crawl space. I poured bleach into every drain. Nothing helped. The odor followed Dad from room to room. Flies gathered on the outside of whichever window he sat beside, tapping against the glass as though trying to reach him. Our dog, Duke, would not enter the house. Duke had slept beside Dad's chair for 9 years. Now, whenever Dad opened the door, the old hound lowered his body, bared his teeth, and whimpered. On the 6th morning, Duke disappeared. I found him beneath the dock. There were 2 small wounds beneath his jaw, and the ground around him was dry. His body looked strangely light, almost hollow. Dad stood at the top of the bank while I wrapped Duke in a feed sack. "Coyotes," he said. There had been no coyotes in our part of the parish for years. That afternoon, I noticed mud on Dad's bare feet. The mud was black and smelled like the riverbed. I asked where he had been. He looked at me for so long that I wished I had stayed silent. Then he smiled with his mouth closed. "Fishing." His boat had not moved. The animal deaths spread beyond our property. The Beaudrys lost 3 chickens. Mr. Landry found a calf lying beside an unbroken fence with no blood beneath it. People began locking their barns at night. Dad grew stronger. Before the river, he had complained about pain in his back and knees. Afterward, I watched him lift a 200-pound engine block from the shed floor without bending his legs. He carried it outside like an empty box. At night, I heard him walking through the hallway. One set of footsteps would pass my door, then another set would follow, lighter and wet, though I could see only one shadow beneath the door. On the 12th night, I decided to follow him. Dad left the house at 1 in the morning. He moved toward the smokehouse without a flashlight. The moon was gone, but he crossed the yard as if he could see through darkness. I waited until he disappeared inside, then crept to the side window. One of our goats lay across the work table. Dad was bent over it. At first, I thought he was crying. His shoulders moved in short, violent jerks. Then he lifted his head. Dark liquid covered his mouth. He turned toward the window before I made a sound. For 1 second,
His face did not look like my father's. It seemed longer, older, and thin enough for the bones to press against the skin. Something behind his eyes stared directly at me. Then, Dad smiled. "Eli," he said through the glass. I ran back to the house. He was already sitting at the kitchen table when I reached the door. There was no blood on his face. "Bad dream?" he asked. And from somewhere beneath the floorboards, I heard the goat give one final cry.
I told Mum what I had seen. She slapped me before I finished. It was the only time she ever hit me. The instant her hand touched my face, she began to cry. She said Dad was sick, and that sickness could make a person strange. She said I was frightened and letting old stories poison my mind. But she began locking our bedroom doors at night. The next morning, she called Dr. Harlan from town. Dad sat calmly while the doctor listened to his chest. After a few seconds, Harlan moved the stethoscope, pressed it harder, then checked the instrument with his fingers. "Jonah, take a deep breath." Dad inhaled. The doctor's face lost its color. He pressed 2 fingers to Dad's neck. Dad watched him with quiet amusement. "Equipment trouble?" Dad asked. Harlan stepped backward. Dad caught his wrist. The doctor screamed. It took both Mom and me to make Dad let go. Harlan left without his medical bag. He told us he would send an ambulance, but no ambulance came. Years later, I learned he drove directly to his sister's house in Baton Rouge and never practiced in Briar's Ferry again. Dad stood at the window until Harlan's car disappeared. "People should mind their own bodies," he said. On the 31st day after the river, our relatives gathered at our house for the anniversary of my grandmother's death. Mom wanted to cancel, but Dad insisted. He said family belonged together under one roof. By sunset, 24 people filled the farmhouse. Food covered the kitchen counters. Children chased one another through the rooms. My uncles played cards on the porch. For the first time in a month, Dad acted almost normal. He laughed at the right moments. He remembered names. He told my aunt the same story about a broken fishing line that he had told every year since I was little. I began to wonder if I had imagined everything. Then, my cousin's baby started crying. Dad stopped speaking in the middle of a sentence. His head turned toward the sound. The baby was in my aunt's arms across the room. Dad stared at the child, with his lips slightly open. A thin strand of saliva touched his lower lip. I stepped between them. "Dad!" Every lamp in the house went out. Someone screamed. Plates shattered in the kitchen. In the darkness, I heard a wet, dragging sound move across the floor. When Uncle Graham lit an oil lantern, Dad was no longer beside me. He stood behind my aunt. One hand rested on her shoulder. The other reached toward the baby's throat. I struck him with a chair. The chair broke. Dad did not move. He turned and looked at me, with eyes that reflected the lantern like an animal's. "Don't call me that," he said. His voice came from several places in the room at once. Mom pushed through the crowd. "Jonah?" Dad's smile widened. Jonah stopped breathing beneath Black Cypress Bridge. Nobody moved. He died before the boat turned around. I was the one who brought him home. Mom made a sound I had never heard from another human being. The thing wearing Dad lunged toward the baby. 6 men dragged it to the center support post and wrapped it in rope and logging chain. It fought without making a sound. Its skin tore beneath the chain, but no blood appeared. When it finally stopped struggling, it looked directly at me. "You tied up my boat," it said.
I remembered the fog, the cold hand on my shoulder, and the 3 knocks at the door. "Your mother let me in," it whispered, "but you brought me to shore." Then it began laughing with the same dry, broken sound fishermen claim to hear beneath Black Cypress Bridge. No priest in Briar's Ferry would come to our house. Uncle Graham drove to the church himself, but Father Benoit locked the rectory door when he heard Jonah Mercer's name. The sheriff arrived, looked through the kitchen window, and left without getting out of his car. It was Miss Bernice Landry who told us to find Amos Bell. Amos lived 2 parishes away, in a house surrounded by bottles hanging from bare trees. People called him a healer when they needed him, and a sorcerer when they did not. He had buried restless things, cleansed flooded homes, and once spent 3 nights inside a cemetery where every grave had opened at the same time. Uncle Graham brought him to us shortly before 3 in the morning. Amos was small, grey-haired, and dressed in a dark suit polished shiny with age. He carried a wooden case in one hand and a brass bell in the other. He stopped at the edge of our yard. "How long has the dead man been inside?" he asked. Mum nearly collapsed. Amos had not seen Dad yet. He entered through the back door and told everyone to remain silent. The thing at the post watched him approach. Its expression changed from amusement to hatred. Amos opened Dad's eyelid with one thumb, examined his gums, and pressed a silver dime against the center of his chest. The coin turned black. "Corpse rider," Amos said. The thing spat at his shoes. Amos did not move. He explained that some spirits possessed the living, but a corpse rider preferred an empty body. It entered during the first moments after death, before the soul understood what had happened. It borrowed the dead person's memories, habits, and voice. For a while, it could make the body appear alive, but it could not stop decay. Blood kept the flesh warm. The blood of animals worked at first. Human blood lasted longer. Everyone looked toward the baby. Mum shook her head again and again. "He knows me," she said. "He remembers our wedding. He remembers the song we danced to." The thing at the post softened its face. "Ruth," it said in Dad's warmest voice. "Honey, don't let this man hurt me." Amos turned to her. "Memory lives in the body," he said. "Love does not." Then he faced the thing. "Where is Jonah Mercer?" Dad's body grinned. "Cold." The windows began to tremble. "Where?" Amos asked again. "Under the bridge. He is still trying to swim home." Mum covered her mouth. I stepped forward. "What are you?" The thing looked pleased that I had spoken to it. "I was old when they drove the first iron post into that river. Men fell into my water, and their fear fed me. Your father saw me above him. His heart stopped before he could finish his prayer." It pulled against the chain. The support post groaned. His body was strong. His family opened the door. Why should I have left such a generous gift to rot? Amos struck the brass bell once. The sound was thin and sharp. Dad's body convulsed so violently that the floor shook. Amos looked at Mom and then at me. "I can force it out," he said, "but understand me. There is no living man inside that body. When the rider leaves, you will see what the river sent home." Mum could not answer, so I did. "Get it out of my father."
Amos ordered everyone except Mum, Uncle Graham, and me out of the house. From his wooden case he removed 7 silver dimes, a bundle of yellow paper seals, a jar of grey ash, and a short blade carved from black oak. Strange letters had been burned into the wood. The blade had no sharp edge, but the thing at the post recoiled when it saw it. Amos placed the 7 dimes in a circle around Dad's feet. He pasted 1 paper seal above every door and window. Then he mixed salt with the ash and drew a line across the kitchen threshold. "Whatever voice you hear," he told us, "do not step inside the circle. Do not answer a question. Do not say Jonah's name." The thing smiled at Mum. "Ruth, remember Mobile?" She closed her eyes. "Remember the yellow dress? Remember how it rained on the hotel roof?" Tears ran down her face. Those were memories no stranger could have known. Amos lifted the brass bell and began to speak in a language I did not recognize. The words were quiet and rhythmic, like stones dropped one at a time into a deep well. The dimes began to vibrate. At first, they only clicked against the floorboards. Then each coin slowly turned on its edge. A red glow appeared around their rims. Dad's body pulled against the chains. The ropes snapped. The logging chain held. "Eli," the thing said. I looked away. "Son, please." It sounded exactly like Dad on the morning he taught me to bait a hook. The layered voice was gone. The hatred was gone. I heard only fear. "It has me trapped," the voice said. "I'm still in here." My foot moved toward the circle. Amos rang the bell. The sound struck my chest like a fist. "That is not your father," he said. Dad began to cry. Real tears rolled down his cheeks. "Eli, I'm cold. Help me." I remembered tying the boat to shore. I remembered the way he had knocked instead of using his key. I wanted to believe some part of him had survived inside that body. Then the thing made a mistake. "Remember the red boat?" it asked. "The one where I taught you to swim." My father had taught me to swim from a green boat. I stepped backward. The tears stopped instantly. The thing's face twisted. "Ungrateful little animal." Every window in the kitchen burst inward. Wind tore through the room, carrying the smell of mud, dead fish, and open graves. The paper seals snapped in the air, but remained fixed to the frames. Amos continued his prayer. The 7 dimes glowed brighter. Smoke rose from the soles of Dad's feet. His head rolled backward, and something black moved beneath the skin of his throat. It climbed toward his mouth like a snake trapped inside cloth. Mum screamed his name. The moment she spoke, one of the paper seals tore in half. The black shape changed direction. It shot beneath Dad's skin toward his right hand. His arm stretched across the circle farther than any human arm should have reached and closed around Mum's wrist. Her skin turned gray beneath his fingers. I grabbed the black oak blade from the table. Amos shouted for me to stop. I stepped across the line and drove the wooden blade into Dad's forearm. There was no blood. A sound came from his body, like 100 people gasping at once. His hand opened, and Mum fell backward into Uncle Graham's arms. The thing turned its black eyes toward me. "Now I know your door,"
it whispered. Amos seized my collar and pulled me out of the circle. Then he rang the bell for the second time.
The second ring changed the room. The walls seemed to move farther away. The kitchen ceiling disappeared into darkness, and for one impossible moment, I could see Black Cypress Bridge hanging above us. Moonlight shone through its iron beams. Dark water moved beneath the floorboards. Dad's body was no longer tied to a post. He stood in the center of the river. Water reached his chest. Behind him, a tall shadow sat on the bridge railing with its legs hanging over the edge. Dad looked at me. This time, I knew it was really him. His eyes were frightened, but they were his eyes. He did not ask me to save him. He did not tell me he was cold. He said only 5 words. Don't let it wear me. The shadow dropped from the bridge. The kitchen slammed back into place. Dad's body threw itself against the chain. The support post split from top to bottom. Uncle Graham dragged Mum toward the doorway, while Amos scattered ash across the glowing coins. He rang the bell a third time. Dad's back arched. A stream of black vapor poured from his mouth and struck the ceiling. It spread above us like oil on water. Faces appeared inside it, opening and closing their mouths without sound. Amos rang the bell a 4th time. The vapor folded inward. The thing screamed through Dad's voice, the baby's voice, my mother's voice, and finally, my own. I will leave this one, it said. Give me the boy. Amos rang the bell a 5th time. The silver dimes turned white with heat. The black vapor dropped toward me. It stopped at the edge of the coin circle, as if it had struck glass. Amos picked up the oak blade. The thing began to beg. It promised money buried beneath the bridge. It promised to return Dad alive. It promised that no one in our family would ever die if we allowed it to remain. Amos rang the bell a 6th time. The promises became curses. The house shook. Cabinet doors opened and slammed. Black river water pushed through the cracks between the floorboards and rose around our shoes. Amos stepped inside the circle. He placed the tip of the wooden blade against the center of Dad's chest. The thing stared at me. You brought me home, it said. I will always know you. Amos rang the bell for the 7th and final time. Then he struck. The oak blade hit Dad's chest with a sound like a tree splitting in winter. The black vapor collapsed into his body. Every glowing coin jumped from the floor and struck him at once. The scream that followed did not come from a human throat. It came from the walls, the river, and the iron bones of Black Cypress Bridge. People heard it 3 miles away. Then, everything stopped. Dad's body sagged against the chain. The river water vanished from the floor. The paper seals fell from the windows. For a few seconds, he looked peaceful. Then, 31 days caught up with him. His skin faded from pale to gray. His cheeks sank. Dark stains spread beneath his shirt, and the sweet smell in the house became so powerful that Uncle Graham vomited on the porch. The familiar shape of my father seemed to collapse inward, revealing the truth that had been hidden from us. We had eaten beside a corpse. We had slept in the next room. My mother had kissed it goodnight.
Amos pressed 2 fingers against Dad's closed eyelids and whispered a final prayer. "Jonah Mercer is gone," he said. "Now we must make certain nothing wears him again."
Amos would not allow us to bury Dad. He said a body once occupied by a corpse rider remained like an unlocked house. Other things could enter it, weaker things perhaps, but hungry all the same. Dad had to be cremated before the following midnight. The funeral home in Briar's Ferry refused to take him. Uncle Graham drove the body to a crematory outside Baton Rouge, while Amos sat beside the coffin and held the brass bell in his lap. Mom and I followed in our truck. We did not have a funeral. There were no flowers, hymns, or neighbors carrying food. We watched a plain wooden box enter the furnace, and we waited until Amos saw flame through the small glass window. Only then did he relax. When the crematory worker brought us the ashes, 7 blackened dimes lay at the bottom of the metal container. Amos removed them with iron tongs. "These do not belong to your father," he said. He placed the coins in a jar of salt and took them with him. That night, every dog in Briar's Ferry began barking toward the river. Black Cypress Bridge collapsed during a storm 3 weeks later. The center span twisted free and disappeared beneath the water. Divers searched for it, but found only timber, broken iron, and the remains of several people who had been missing for decades. They never found my father's boat battery. Mom sold the fishing equipment and covered our dock with boards. She lived another 18 years, but she never again opened a door after sunset. If someone knocked, they had to call her name from the yard and stand where she could see their face. Even then, she made them wait until morning. I left Louisiana after graduation. I built a life in Tennessee, married, and had a son of my own. I told him his grandfather had drowned. I never told him what came home afterward. For a long time, I believed Amos had destroyed it. Then Mom died, and I returned to Briar's Ferry to empty the farmhouse. The town had changed. The gas station was abandoned. The church had a new roof. Nothing remained of Black Cypress Bridge except 2 concrete supports rising from the river. On my final night in the house, I woke at 2:16 in the morning. Someone was knocking at the back door. 3 slow knocks. I stood in the hallway without breathing. The old porch light was on. Through the curtain, I could see a broad-shouldered man waiting outside. Water dripped from his clothes. His head was lowered, but I recognized the crooked line of his smile. "Eli?" my father called softly. I did not move. "I got the boat tied up. Open the door." The knob turned once, then again. I remembered what Amos had said about an unlocked house. I remembered that Mom had invited the thing inside because it wore a face she loved. "You aren't my father," I said. The figure outside became completely still. When it answered, the voice no longer belonged to anyone I knew. "No," it said, "but your son will know yours." The porch light went out. By the time the sun rose, the yard was empty. Only 2 wet footprints remained on the top step. They pointed toward the door, not away from it. I burned the farmhouse that morning. I have never returned to Briar's Ferry. I have never taken my son near the Belém River. And I have never answered a knock after midnight, no matter whose voice is waiting on the other side. Because the thing beneath Black Cypress Bridge was not destroyed. It was only left without a body. And sooner or later, it will find another face that someone is willing to let inside. And that was, "The devil wore my father's body."
The most frightening monsters are not always the ones waiting in darkness. Sometimes they return wearing a familiar face. They remember private moments, speak with a beloved voice, and stand patiently outside the door until grief gives them permission to enter. If someone you had lost came home tonight, would you trust your heart? Or would you leave the door locked until sunrise? Tell me what you would do in the comments. And if your hometown has a legend about the dead returning, share it below. Your story may inspire a future episode. Thank you for listening. If this story made you question every knock after midnight, leave a like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more ghost stories, cursed legends, and late-night horror from around the world. This is MC Noctis. Until we meet again, remember that a familiar voice is not proof of a familiar soul. And when the dead come knocking, never open the door.